Hi class, welcome to our second part of lecture one. We're going to continue on and hopefully finish the lecture, our first PowerPoint rather, with the second part of the lecture. Okay, so let's just continue where we left off. Let's continue to talk about comparative politics and what we're going to be doing this semester. And we're going to go on with research methods. And there's actually kind of a debate going on in social sciences and in political science in particular on the best way to gather data for research. How should we be pursuing this information? How should we be pursuing research? And you have the qualitative camp and you have the quantitative camp. And it's important for this class and for our first test that you know the difference. And let's go over that now, qualitative versus quantitative. So qualitative research is a study that uses in-depth investigation of a limited number of cases, okay? So qualitative research is more what's used in comparative politics, okay? You're doing in-depth research with not a lot of cases. So you're gonna spend a lot of time exploring the internal systems of maybe 1, 2, or 3 countries, and then comparing those countries and making and drawing conclusions. So it's slow, it's tedious, it's very difficult work that has a lot of issues, but it can be very effective because the amount of time spent in the detail that is done in qualitative research. And again, comparative politics tends to use qualitative research. On the other hand, you have the quantitative camp, okay? And this is becoming more and more popular. You're seeing a lot of switch to quantitative research and research models. And this is a study that uses statistical data from many cases to draw conclusions. So for quantitative research, you might punch the information from 50 or 100, 150 countries into a program. It analyzes all the similarities, all the differences, and it spits out information that you can draw conclusions from. Okay, so you want to discover the likelihood of civil war in 2 different types of government, theocracies and democracies. So you put 50 countries that are democracies and however many you can find that are theocracies. You enter all this into your spreadsheet and it spits out a number, some data that you can draw conclusions from, okay? So some people consider this more of a scientific approach to the study, okay? So both are used and both can be effective in different ways. Now, going on more about qualitative research, how is that data collected? Mostly through interviews, observation, archival evidence, and knowledge. So if you're gonna be conducting research in a qualitative manner, most of the time it requires going to that country and investigating, right? You're conducting interviews with people who maybe were there. You're watching these things happen. You're going through the archives, the governmental archives, to find the data yourself. And because it's so detail oriented, this is why there's not gonna be a lot of number of cases, right? That's why you're probably only gonna be working with a couple of different cases, okay? It's very narrowly focused. So we kind of talked about this already. Let's keep going. Quantitative research, on the other hand, again, uses statistical analysis to prove a hypothesis. It conducts a bunch of countries. It spits the numbers out like we said. And it's more likely to use deductive reasoning, starting with the hypothesis, where comparative politics, or rather qualitative research, tends to use inductive reasoning. Now, moving on, hopefully you understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. If not, again, you could always reach out to me. We can go over it through Zoom or through office hours. Let's look at some other comparative approaches. How do we analyze data? How do we draw conclusions? One way is through something we call game theory. You might have heard of game theory before. It's an approach that emphasizes how actors and or organizations behave in their goal to influence others. Okay, so we're studying different entities to determine how they act. That's all that game theory is. Now, the key point behind game theory is to study this interaction among what we consider rational decision makers. So how are rational decision makers going to react if we put them in different scenarios? That's what game theory is. We're testing different rational actors, different scenarios, and drawing conclusions and hypotheses from that, okay? So maybe the most famous example of game theory is the prisoner's dilemma. Maybe you've heard it before. Essentially, you put 2 people in a prison who committed a crime. Their options are to rat on each other or to not rat on each other, or one could rat and the other could not rat. And it explores how the rational individual will handle that scenario. And if you look at the data, it usually concludes that the best individual scenario for rational being would be rat on the other person, because it gives you the best chance, the best possible outcome. So I have a video that actually goes over this in great detail, and there's a few variations of the prisoner's dilemma. I'm going to ask that you do watch this, because I think it will give you a much better understanding of what the prisoner's dilemma is. Okay. You don't need to know too much detail about it, but I do want you to know it's an example of game theory. And I do want you to know how game theory works, what the premise is. So we mentioned rationality, which is an assumption in game theory, right? So let's move on to another term that we need to know throughout this semester, and that's rational choice theory, a theory, I should say, right? Rational choice theory. And this is an approach that does assume that individuals are rational, and therefore when they make decisions, and this applies to countries as well, states or countries as well, when individuals or countries make decisions, they weigh the costs and benefits and make choices to maximize their benefit. That's, again, going back to the prisoner's dilemma. You're assuming they're going to make the choice that maximizes their benefits, okay? And if you believe this to be true, perhaps you can predict some behavior, right? Because if you assume that countries are always going to make the decision that's rational, it's best for them, maybe we'll know what that decision is beforehand, okay? And I think that begs the question, and this is one of the questions I actually ask you, and we'll go over to our discussion for week 1. Number 3, are human beings rational? Why or why not? I think an argument can be made either way, right? You can argue that, yes, human beings are always going to make the decision that benefits them or maybe their family or their country the best, right? But I think you can also argue the other way. I think people make very stupid decisions that are based on perhaps emotion or pride or ego that aren't always rational. So I think there's a debate to be had about rational choice theory. So explore that in the discussions, right? I look forward to reading your answers. So here's a quick video, again, optional that you watch this, but it explores the limits of rationality and basically answers the question I just asked you. Will individuals always act rationally? And are the choices of actors or states always rational? Okay, so to end this lecture, we're going to talk about some of the difficulties that we run into in comparative research. What are some of the problems? And there are many, okay? And we're going to outline 7 different challenges we as political scientists, you as students, will run into with comparative politics research, okay? The first problem is difficulty controlling the variables in the case you are studying. So when you're searching for these correlations and these causations, which you talked about, sometimes you can't draw these correlations or even causations because maybe they don't exist, or maybe country A and country B are so different, there's really no way to compare them. This is a possibility. You might be doing research on 2 different countries and say, you know, their histories and cultures are so different, there's no basis for comparison here. They're just too different. That is a genuine possibility. Second problem is the interaction between the variables themselves. You run into problems of multi-causality. What does multi-causality mean? Well, maybe the issue is caused by not just one thing. We used the example in our last lecture of ice cream and murder, but it's really tied to heat increase, right? Maybe there's 2 reasons for something to happen. Maybe there's 50 reasons, okay? And this can get very complicated. It can be difficult to account for every reason. And life is complex, guys. Very rarely are you gonna have one problem that has one cause, okay? It's usually gonna be a myriad of issues. And it can be hard to control for all those issues in comparative research. Okay, we talked about that. The third problem, limits to information. This is the most basic problem maybe. Sometimes there's too few cases to work with, right? There's around 200 countries in the world. A lot of them are relatively new countries, you know, I think like South Sudan, that haven't really existed for a long time. So how are you going to make comparisons between 2 different cultures if one has only existed for 10 years and one's existed for 2,000 years or 200 years, right? It can be very difficult to have this information and access this information. The fourth problem, access to cases. Another very simple problem, but can be very detrimental. Like I said before, this is very detail-oriented work. So a lot of times you have to be on site. Well, that research can be hindered by what's going on in the country. As I speak, they're evacuating Afghanistan. The Taliban's taking over. How are you going to go and do research in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, right? That's going to be very difficult and very dangerous. So those limitations, dangers in some parts of the world, can hinder political science and comparative research. Fifth problem, bias, right? We talked about this with modernization theory in the 20th century. Researchers tend, especially in the past, to focus on certain areas, primarily the West, Western Europe, United States, North America. As a result, some places in the world, Asia particularly, are severely lacking in research. So, more of an emphasis in Western colleges towards the West has led to bias and less research in some areas of the world. So that's very limiting if you're trying to compare countries in the Far East. You're not going to have maybe all the data that you would want. 6, bias, basically what we just said, selection bias. If you're learning in a school that emphasizes Western values or Western education, you might develop selection bias and do your research on Western countries as well. Very similar problem to our last issue, issue 5. Issue number 7, reverse causation. It's sometimes difficult to determine what is the cause and what is the effect. We talked about correlation and cause and effect. Let's stick with cause and effect here. How do you know that problem A is causing problem B, and it's not that problem B is causing problem A? That can be very difficult to determine. The example I use here on your lecture notes is, how do we know that countries with low rates of female literacy are less likely to be democratic? That's actually a true fact. Countries with low rates of female literacy are less likely to be democratic. So how do we know whether low rates of female literacy cause democracy to halt, or perhaps less democratic countries cause lower rates of female literacy? So it's a chicken and the egg question, right? Again, I'll repeat that because it gets a little confusing. Does a lack of democracy cause a lack of female literacy, or does a lack of female literacy cause a lack of democracy, right? It's very difficult to determine, and we'd have to research that case and try to solve that problem. That's what we call reverse causation. That's a problem we sometimes run into in comparative research. So that's going to do it, guys, for lecture 1. This is only a 2-part, so we have part 1A and part 1B. Again, this is how we're going to be doing this semester. We'll be breaking up your lectures into 2 to 4 parts. So I look forward again to getting to know you guys better, and have a wonderful day.